We have seen a lot of crazy things in the last few weeks, like a worldwide quarantine, a complete shutdown of the world's economy, and the fastest stock market plunge in history. Now, despite how shocking those things have been, there's one part of this crisis that hasn't really been talked about by anyone. Yet, this would likely be the #1 story in the world during any other time in history. The United States, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iraq, Iran, China, and Canada. What do these countries have in common? Well, not much, actually, except that these are the world's largest oil producers. And as you may know, oil has historically been a hot commodity that can single-handedly determine if a country or state is going to be rich or poor. I mean, let's take Norway for example. Norway right now has the 6th highest GDP per capita in the world. It is the 2nd wealthiest country in terms of monetary value. It consistently ranks in the top 3 in the world in regards to standard of living, and it has the 2nd largest capital reserve in the world as well. So it is quite easy to say that Norway is very rich, but it wasn't always like this. You see, in the 1950s, Norway was largely a fishing and agricultural nation, and wasn't anywhere near as wealthy as it is today. But then, in the late 1960s, Norway struck oil in the North Sea. And as it turns out, they ended up discovering one of the largest oil reserves in the world, and soon began extracting it through a state-run company called Statoil. The purpose of this company was to sell the oil to other countries, and then use those profits to invest back into Norway, its citizens, and a state wealth fund. So over the course of the next several decades after the oil discovery, Norway would surpass the likes of Canada, Germany, and even the United States in terms of average wealth of its citizens. And this example of how oil can rapidly increase the wealth of a country can be applied to virtually every other country that discovers vast quantities of oil within its borders. However, there is a difference between how countries handle their newfound oil winnings. Norway is probably the best example of how oil can provide both short-term and long-term wealth for its citizens. But there are some examples of countries mismanaging their newfound oil. Let's take, for example, Venezuela, who has the largest proven oil reserve in the world. They were a fairly well-off developing nation in the early 2000s, but the problem was that they built their economy entirely on the price of oil, and they did this without a reserve fund or diversification plan like Norway did. So when the price of oil dropped by 68% over the course of 72 weeks between 2014 and 2016, that sent Venezuela's economy into a downward spiral. And I want you to remember those numbers that I just mentioned. A 68% drop over 72 weeks. So now let's bring this back to today. You see, about 3 months ago, I was at the gas station and filled up my car, which cost around $80 or about $1.32 a liter. But then, about a week ago, I went to that very same gas station, and the cost to fill up my car was now $48 or about 75 cents per liter. And that was when I knew that something unprecedented had happened to the world's economy. You see, over the course of the last 12 weeks, the price of oil has dropped by 68%. That is the same price drop that caused Venezuela's economy to enter a crisis, but the difference is that this time it only took 12 weeks, meanwhile the previous drop took 72 weeks. This means that we are living through arguably the sharpest decline of an energy commodity in the world's history. Yet because of the current news cycle, it's not being brought up with the frequency that I think it should be. So how did this drop happen? Well, it was a two-pronged attack. The first of which was that the demand for oil began to dry up when the worldwide lockdowns started happening. Think about this. Roughly 2/3 of all oil that is extracted from the ground goes into transportation vehicles such as cars, boats, trucks, and planes. But now there has been over a 90% reduction in overall travel since the outbreak, meaning that people aren't filling up their cars at the gas station as much, and the same applies to boats, trucks, and planes. And as we all know from basic economics, as soon as the demand for a product drops off a cliff, then a rapid price decline will likely follow. And after there's a price decline, it becomes much more difficult to turn a profit for those existing companies, so those companies will begin to go through a tough economic time and potentially even face bankruptcy. So if the global lockdowns weren't enough to decimate the oil and gas industry, industry, then the second part of this attack would do it. You see, early in March of this year, leaders from Saudi Arabia, Russia, and a handful of other countries met up to discuss how much oil should be produced during the worldwide global lockdowns. Saudi Arabia, who is the world's #1 crude oil producer, wanted everyone to cut oil production in order to maintain a stable oil price. Most of the countries agreed, except for one. And that was Russia. You see, Russia was hoping that all other countries would cut their oil production, which would make their oil more expensive than Russia's, so then Russia could attract more global buyers for the cheaper oil. And of course, the energy powerhouse in Saudi Arabia did not like this. So they went, hey, we produce way more oil than you, it costs us way less to extract our oil, and we make way more money than you. So we are going to beat you at your own game. So that is when Saudi Arabia decided to send a message to Russia. The Saudis announced that they would start increasing oil production by a whopping 30% in one day in hopes of undercutting Russia and thereby taking a stranglehold on the global oil market. And if that wasn't enough, they also announced that they would cut oil prices to preferred customers and keep increasing oil production throughout the year. And that is how the oil market collapsed within the span of a few months. It is quite rare that you see an attack on an entire industry from both the supply side and the demand side. So this might be the perfect storm for a few unfortunate places on Earth. Because even though oil-rich countries might be able to handle a dramatic decrease in the price of oil, many towns, states, and provinces within those countries where oil production occurs, they will not be able to handle this decrease in the price of oil. This is because countries tend to have more diversified economies than smaller local populations like towns, cities, or even states. In fact, there are many towns, cities, states, and provinces out there where a giant chunk of their economy comes directly from the oil industry. Let's take, for example, Alberta, Canada. It's an absolutely beautiful province filled with mountains, parks, lakes, and forests. The GDP of Alberta is roughly $338 billion, which gives it a bigger economy than places like Mississippi, Montana, and Nevada combined. But like most oil-rich places, Alberta was an agricultural and farming land not too long ago. In fact, up until 1947, Alberta was one of the smaller provinces in Canada with very little impact on the economic activity of the entire country. But then the economic gods gave Alberta one of the greatest discoveries in history. It was called Leduc No. 1, also known as the oil sands. After the discovery of the oil sands, which is one of the largest oil reserves in the world, Alberta went through an oil boom that saw the province become a backbone of Canada's economy. And by 1985, 35% of Alberta's economy was based off of the oil industry. And today, Alberta's oil industry accounts for roughly 7% of Canada's overall GDP and nearly 90% of Canada's overall oil production. But over the last 12 weeks, the oil-rich province has seen its economy turn upside down. This is because 1 out of every 10 citizens in this province works in the oil and gas industry. And because of the dramatic drop in the price of oil, many of the province's biggest employers are now facing bankruptcy. For the province, this drop could cause hundreds of thousands of people to lose their jobs and cause a decrease of billions of dollars in the province's GDP. And keep in mind that everyone in Alberta and all other affected oil-rich places are going through all of the tough economic times that the rest of the world is, plus they have an oil crisis on top of everything. Now, typically what oil towns see when there's a significant drop in oil prices is a modest decrease in population size, usually between 2 and 10%, a spike in individual bankruptcies by about 35%, and a moderate increase in homelessness, unemployment, and crime. So, when you combine those factors along with the global economic collapse and the stock market crash, we might see the creation of ghost cities at a rate that we have never seen before. You see, ghost cities are created typically when there's a rush or a boom of a resource in a city. This can be anything like silver, gold, coal, or even oil. And over the course of several decades, that city becomes very dependent on that resource. So if the resource runs out or if the resource loses value, then people begin to migrate out of of that city just as fast as they migrated in. And it looks like this is what we should expect, unfortunately, in some cities in the world right now. And if this situation wasn't dire enough, already this year, 208 North American oil producers have already filed for bankruptcy, and many others were hanging on by a thread before this crisis. And as of this week, many of the larger oil companies have cut billions of dollars worth of projects and labor in order to hopefully prevent bankruptcy. So even though the situation sounds bleak right now, there are a few things that could make the situation have a little bit more of a positive spin on it. For example, right now gas prices are substantially cheaper, meaning that consumers that are struggling to get by will be able to save a substantial amount of money when filling up at the pump. Another is that this might be another step towards the world using more efficient sources of energy like nuclear, hydro, or maybe solar. But at the end of the day, the oil and gas industry is going to hurt. In fact, the Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, might have said it best. Alberta's energy sector supports more than 500,000 jobs across Canada, and this is the most significant and disruptive economic downturn in generations. It will get worse before it gets better. So what do you think of the oil industry and its downturn? Has it impacted your life at all? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave a like. I'm making a couple of these kinds of videos every week. And make sure to check out the documentaries playlist on my channel, where I have a ton of other videos similar to this in that playlist. So make sure to click on that, and I will see you guys, well, I guess in a few seconds.